Good afternoon and welcome to lecture 3 of the 11 lecture series on why does disability research matter. Today we shall be talking about desire and its relationship with disability. How can we understand desire from the perspective of disability? And we are extremely privileged and honored to have with us today Professor Daniel Goodley to share his thoughts on the issue. Welcome, Professor Goodley. But before I hand over the virtual mic to you, sir, it is also my great privilege to call upon Professor G.J.V. Prasad to chair the session. Professor Prasad has recently retired from the Center of English Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, JNU, New Delhi, and his work is vast. But in the area of disability, he has contributed immensely by trying to forge a kind of connection between disability studies and translation studies. He has edited a book called Disability in Translation and is presently co-editing an anthology of Indian short stories on disability titled Reclaiming the Disabled Subject. Professor Prasad, the platform is yours.
Thank you, Somesh. Somesh is, as usual, very generous. What he hasn't said is that he has a major role to play in all the work I'm doing. His is the major role. And when he says I edited a book on disability and translation studies, disability in translation studies, he was also the editor of that book. In fact, it is through Somesh that I entered the field of disability studies. And I've always enjoyed working with Somesh. And this involvement is in disability studies along with Somesh is, for great intellectual enjoyment for me and hopefully of use to other people. It's wonderful to be chairing Dan Goodley's session, because Dan Goodley, as I think all of you who are here in the session know already, is Professor of Disability Studies and Education at Sheffield University in the School of Education. And he's a major disability studies scholar. He's a major scholar. When he sets out his fields of research, the first one automatically is disability studies. And I'm just looking at this. It is critical disability studies, which is completely multidisciplinary, where it draws on psychology, philosophy, sociology, and education. His other major area of research interest is critical post-humanities, and how can it be not? And where again, he uses it to look at terms of exclusion, disempowerment, political resistance, things of that kind. He also is a co-director of a very interesting project, iHuman, which looks at what it means to be human, what all entails. It's talking about being human. His publications, I just very shortly, because I'm not going to take a long time to introduce somebody who should be well known to all of you. Publications I'm reading backwards. Latest is Disability and Other Human Questions, 2020. Then he had a book on critical educational psychology. And before that, Disability Studies and Interdisciplinary Introduction. This was 2016. The question that he poses in his last book really is what it is to be human. Disability and other human questions. And it's really interesting that Dan Goodley also, like everybody, like many of us, let's just put it like many of us, looks at disability is in terms of a larger matrix of questions about humanity itself, what it means to be human, and also looks at it in terms of political and social questions. And today, he's going to be talking about desire, what it means to desire, and what does it mean, what does desire mean in terms of disability studies. We know human emotions are also constructed. We know, in all of us in literary studies and cultural studies, talk about this all the time, how love can mean different things at different points of time, to different communities, to different groups of people. So what does it mean to desire? And what does it mean in terms of research in disability studies? Extremely interesting question to ask. And we're all looking forward to both the questions and the way he poses them, and to the possible answers that he pushes us towards. All yours, Dan.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. It's such a pleasure and a beautiful introduction. Thank you from both of you. I think I'm going to speak for hopefully about 45 minutes, not too long. I've made available a copy of this paper. I hope that people have got or had an opportunity to see that. You'll see I'm wearing a hat. Welcome to the autumn in Northern England. I've stopped myself from wearing a coat as well, but it's a lot cooler out here at the moment. So it's an absolute pleasure to present this paper today. And it's really exciting to hear about the Centre for Disability Research and Training that is clearly this week of online lectures is marking. And what I want to do is to draw upon a chapter from my latest book, which is called Disability and Other Human Questions. And I want to ask, what is human desire? And hopefully pose a few thoughts for disability research. So the dominant story of desire is, well, perhaps at least in the UK, is a tale of the pursuit of those things that we lack: sex, power, recognition, status, money, hedonism, consumables, property, vacations, fame, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook likes, Botox, Apple's latest, BMWs, lip fillers, gym bodies, perfect partners, gifted and talented children, good lives and equally good deaths. And it seems to me that our desire seems to be increasingly individualistic, where people are more interested in improving themselves than they are of engaging with wider society. Now, the Chinese queer writer Hongwei Bao wrote the following: desire is not simply personal, it's also political, social and cultural. What types of desire one experiences and what one desires are always subject to different social discourses. Desire certainly has its social impact. It can include as much as exclude people. And it can disrupt rigid social hierarchies as well as reinforce them. That's the end of the quote there. So this paper sits with desire. I use the term sit, following the work of Rosemary Garland Thompson. In disability studies, we do a lot of sitting, not necessarily standing. And I want to sit with desire and consider how disability is understood, felt and enacted, with a running parallel project of searching for new ways of desiring. And this new desire, or these new desires, are trained in what Angela McRobbie calls joyful affirmation, the pleasure we get in our sense of being and belonging with each other. So this is a desire that pulls away from a nagging sense of what we lack to a desire to connect with others, to move away from the vulgar materialism of everyday life, captured often in the West, and to think of desire as our connection with other people. So I could start by asking, what do you desire? What drives your passions and interests? What makes you feel satisfied, sated and spent? And these are very demanding questions, and of course have a very different time now during the pandemic, where for many people is simply desire for their loved ones to stay alive. But in the broader world, I think it's fair to say that when we start thinking about what we desire, it draws out very intimate feelings. It potentially might be quite shameful, and it might also be embarrassing thinking about those things that we desire. But one rule I have for dealing with a very difficult personal question is to try and seek a sociological answer. And it seems that if we can find answers outside of ourselves, in our relationships with other people, in the structures of society, and the workings of popular culture, then we need no longer just to think of our desires as within us. They are clearly outside of us too. So we should not consider desire in a social vacuum, as if we live alone or untouched by the social world. Desire is never simply a biological urge nor an animal instinct. And the origins of our desires are always found in the worlds that we inhabit. And we know that society gets into our desires, infects our desires, and molds our desires. In short, society gets under our skin, in our heads, and it floods our emotions. Now, one of the most well-written writers, particularly in the UK, around what we might call the sociology of emotion is a wonderful writer called Sarah Ahmed. And she's written extensively about something called affect economy, where affect is emotion. And she argues that our emotions, our affects, are always caught up in market economies. Romantic love, for example, might be known through the dominant practices of Hollywood or Bollywood. Psychotherapy, novels, songs, and increasingly the memes of social media. So for Ahmed, advertising and marketing companies now know that they need to sell their products, but they sell them through infecting and driving our desires. Now, an example of this for me would be British Christmas time TV adverts. So I'm a big lover of Christmas time. I'm a big fan of Father Christmas. And what is very interesting is that increasingly now around British Christmas time, you will witness on the TV and also on social media various films produced by companies that are trying to sell their goods, but they do so through the telling of very familial and intimate and sentimental narratives. I find myself within seconds crying in front of the TV as I'm told a story of a forlorn rabbit that's missed his family, or of a child who's not going to spend Christmas time with his family. And what we have, of course, is this kind of very classic example of fetishization. That is to say that particular objects are imbued with meaning that did not exist in the first place. So the reason to buy the latest iPhone is not to give more money to Apple, or not to get something that you essentially need, but the iPhone is but one crucial part of improving your emotional life, of connecting you with others. Think about the ways in which big companies like Apple will sell their products through appealing to stories of family, love, and friendship. Sometimes when we come across these adverts, we're not even quite sure what they're selling. It seems to be they're selling particular kinds of relationship. So in this sense, then, we are living increasingly in a world which we might call one marked by emotionalization. That is, we're expected to feel as we think, emote as we consume, and train our desires in the search of emotional fulfillment. And of course, emotion is big business. There are huge industries associated with happiness, therapy, self-help, well-being, mindfulness, psychology. And key to this emotionalization is the pursuit of a desire for the thing that we feel we lack. And so we live in times where people feel increasingly unhappy, empty, unsatisfied, incomplete. Sometimes we understand this language in terms of mental health. But the heart of this, it would seem, is that we live in a society where we are all caught up in an endless search for emotional fulfillment. This always feels fruitless. We will never achieve that true happiness. There will always be a better iPhone. So this, I feel, is the kind of dominant way in which we might understand desire and how we often live desire. So how might we think of desire in different ways? And I want to come to that. And my argument is that disability permits us to rethink desire. And rethinking desire means challenging the current model of desire that has taken over us. And this is a model of desire that is essentially argues that we desire those things that we lack. I'm going to argue that we need to think more progressively about desire, more affirmatively, and crucially more collectively. So I want to throw in a lovely idea of belonging. And belonging is an interesting word because within the idea of belonging is the idea of being and longing to be, to connect with one another. My wife is from South Wales, the country next to England. She has a very distinct and strong accent. And when we first met, we went out for our first date, she asked me, who are you belonging to? That's my very bad Welsh impression, Welsh accent impression. And I said, what do you mean belonging to? And the term belonging is the term that people in South Wales refer to being related. So in Nottingham, where I'm from, we would just ask, who are you related to? In South Wales, you talk about who are you belonging to? And it's really stuck with me as a very beautiful way of describing our kind of connections and interdependence with one another. And so I want to tell you a little story, really, of Manchester Airport Terminal 1 on the 27th of August 2019. It's the arrivals hall. It's 11:20 in the morning. And there's movement, there's impatience, there's energy, there's furtiveness, there's eagerness. Some humans are making their way to the taxi rank. Some run to make the train. Others use wheelchairs to move over to access money from the nearby ATM. Teenagers yawn. Babies cry. Parents manage their offspring's disputes. Families, friends, lovers, colleagues, strangers, taxi drivers, tour guides, university welcome teams greet those that spill out into the hall after safely negotiating the baggage reclaim area. Home. Weary looking faces. There is bed hair, perfect hair, no hair. Sweat, morning breath, hangovers, headaches, crumpled clothes. The physical remains of long haul, short haul, even longer haul. Irritation, impatient, tuts, sighs, confusion, exasperation, but also relief. The plane has landed and there is anticipation. Oh yes, anticipation for that first cup of tea when we get back home, picking up the dogs from the borders, checking the pile of mail, filling in loved ones in person, getting that first washing load into the machine, a takeaway curry from the local Bangladeshi restaurant, falling into one's own bed, home. Holiday budgets have been blown, body clocks displaced, parties smashed, sightseeing, Instas, tweets, Snapchat, selfies, groupies, hyperactivities captured in frozen images. Now this is all done. There is urgency in the movement of the pack for home. This is Manchester, and we are home. So it's difficult sometimes to remind ourselves that some of the most beautiful moments of being human are found in our encounters with one another. Beauty can be found in the frustrations, the morning breath of the bed hair, the impatience and the frazzled senses of the terminal in Manchester Airport. I think it describes what the queer disabled writer Mia Mingis describes as, quote, the magnificence of human community. I love that phrase. And here, what Mingis is alerting us to is the desire to be with others in many different ways. It's not to say that we desire in exactly the same way, but this desire to connect is what makes us human, and something that we need to think about in reconsidering desire. Now, desire to connect is not always benign. It's not always easy. It's never smooth, and it's never conflict-free. But it's about belonging. Belonging merges with being and longing, and this longing to be part of a community and in concert with others feels to me to be like a very strong human urge. So one, the sociologist Yuval Davis argues, is that belonging has three elements to it. The first is social locations. So the ways in which we find ourselves kind of placed along different axes of power, whether it be race, gender, social class, age, sexuality, disability, and so on. And our social locations will dictate where we feel we belong. Second, we have identifications and attachments. We have emotional attachments to places. There's something about a place that will really make us feel we belong. For me, it's Nottingham, where I'm my hometown. Whenever I go there, there's just something within me, a visceral feeling when I'm there about being like Robin Hood in my hometown. And thirdly, there is what Yuval Davis calls ethical and political values that we actually find in our attachment to communities. Human desire, like the arrivals hall at Manchester Airport, is a beautiful thing, especially when it moves us towards propinquity, that is the state of being close to others. This, I think, is a desire for what Angela McRobbie calls joyful affirmation. So where does disability fit with this? And I want to turn on to the idea of connecting here. In a paper written with my friend Catherine Runswick-Cole, we put forward an argument that disability illuminates the human desire for connection. And by this, I'm not trying to romanticize disability, or worse still, romanticize disabled people. The last thing disabled people need is yet another non-disabled person finding exotic ideas of the human within them. What I am going to argue is that throughout their culture, their history, their arts and their political movements, is that disabled people have always magnified the importance of the desire to connect with one another. To the extent to which sometimes disabled people take this desire for connection for granted. It's just part of what it means to be disabled. And these connectivities are very common. Think, for example, of the ways in which humans and animals are connected in the case of service dogs and guide dogs. Think of the ways in which humans and machines are connected. Disabled people have always been connected to machines, whether it be wheelchairs or other prosthetics. And think too of the human and human connections. In the case of personal assistants or support workers. So disability, I would argue, is, if you like, already ahead of the game in thinking about these forms of connection, this desire for human connection. Barbara Gibson calls this disability connectivities. The centrality of connectivity, care, and support. It is, of course, at the heart of something called interdependence. And interdependence is at the heart of all good communities. And to pursue interdependence, I believe, unveils new kinds of desire. Desire itself, Margaret Shildrick writes, is no longer figured in terms of lack, but is directed instead outwards to establish ever new zones of connection. The truth is that our capacities as human beings are always dependent upon others. And as I said earlier, disabled people have known this for years. Now, over the last 15 to 20 years, I've been lucky enough to spend time with a particular disability collectivity, and that is the collectivity of self-advocacy. And self-advocacy refers to the connections and groups of people with intellectual disability who have come together, forged common bonds, and created groups that are about supporting one another. And for a number of years, I was lucky enough to be an advisor, a supporter to a group, to Huddersfield People First, which was a self-advocacy group. And I want to tell you a story from that group that happened in summer in 1997, a long time ago now. And I'm going to introduce you in the story to some of the members, the people with learning disabilities that ran that group. And I want to tell this story to show you, if you like, to give you an example of desiring connection with one another. So it's our monthly meeting, summer 1997. What do you mean she's not coming? Dorothy eyeballed the group. Boris said she's not allowed to come, Lawrence explained. She's been grounded. Grounded, Dorothy proclaimed. Rosa's 32 years old. What has she done? Turns out, Lawrence continues, sipping from his can of cola, that she went to bingo on Thursday night and got back home after the curfew. I ask, who's this Boris then? He's staff. He's the manager of Rosa's group home. A group home. That's where Rosa lives. It's a common place for residents with people with learning disabilities. If you're not still living at home with your parents, then you're more likely to be in a group home, Andy once told me. And in the UK, we've started calling these group homes 10-bedded units. Home or units, Rose was incarcerated in hers on this sunny Saturday morning rather than being here at Huddersfield People First, a self-advocacy group that she had attended for the last 8 years without missing a meeting. Dorothy is the chair of People First group. Right, Dorothy announces, let's go and get her. Without further ado, members kick back their chairs and make their way out the building. Alan pushes Rob's wheelchair. Johnny opens the door so that Michelle can get her walker through the doorway into the lobby. Andy lights up a cigarette. Johnny complains about him smoking. Dorothy borrows a light off Andy and also puffs away. Asif has arrived just in time. He's carrying a bag of biscuits, tea bags and coffee for the break time. Mac and Julie smile in anticipation of the confrontation that lies ahead. Joe looks a little bit worried. Jeannie and Nicola shout at Joe to get a move on. Sean and Jeff hold hands as they make their way out into the sun. married for 15 years now. All of these people outside of the group will be known as people with intellectual disabilities. In the group, they're known by their first names. Within 20 minutes, we make our way out of the town centre and we're walking along the footpath by the basin of the Manchester Canal. A smoky haze from the chimney of a nearby moored canal boat snakes across the water, picking up the sun's rays. A couple of dog walkers stop to let our group pass. A mountain biker impatiently leans on his handlebars as the last of our contingent make our way through the rusty wrought iron gate that leads from the footway into the cul-de-sac where Rosa lives. Within 2 minutes, we're all outside Rosa's group home. Dorothy bangs loudly on the door, her fist raised in anger. The door is opened. Hello, Dorothy. Hello, everybody. It's Tina. She's also known as a staff member. The word staff, by the way, is often used as a put down for professionals. Tina, by the way, is known as one of the good staff by the group. Known to like a drink of wine or five, she's also known by members of the group to go along to the local karaoke that is held in the day centre on the first Friday of every month. She's a right laugh, Andy once told me. I'm good, Tina, Dorothy says, but we've come to speak to Rosa and to Boris if he's around. With that, Dorothy marches past Tina into the huge TV room of the group home. The rest of the Huddersfield People First contingent follow. We enter the living room. Strip lighting casts a migraine-inducing illumination over the TV. Rosa and three of her other residents are sat quietly in chairs. What are you doing here? Rosa asks, a broad grin filling her face. We've come to get you, love, Dorothy replies. And while we're at it, where is that bloody Boris? As if he'd been listening, Boris barges into the room, loudly slamming the door of his office. He is fat, with blonde hair all over, and he's got a Times newspaper under his arm. He's clearly been completing the crossword rather than actually doing anything with people in the group home. He has handwritten a sign on his door office which reads, Main Office. Only authorised individuals are allowed to enter this room. Hello, Dorothy, Boris says. What are you doing here then? Who brought the cavalry? We've come here for Rosa, love, Dorothy shouts. And the next time you think about grounding one of our members, then you might want to speak to us beforehand. We are people first, remember. And with that, Dorothy and Rosa march arm in arm through the front door, and we make our way to the group meeting. Sometimes in the individualistic consumer society that we live in, we often might feel that we only yearn for those things that we think we lack. And we sometimes forget that some of our fellow human beings are denied the most basic of human rights. People with learning disabilities or intellectual disabilities are often denied opportunities to sate the most basest or most basic of desires. Rosa was not demanding a lot. She just wanted to come to the meeting to see her friends. But she'd been naughty. An adult, by the way, was naughty and had been grounded. But luckily, Dorothy, Rosa, Asif, Johnny, Andy, Jeannie, Nicola, and so on, all these members of the group demonstrate a clear generosity of engagement with one another. Their desire to support one another shines through, or was shining through, to a time when many rights of adults who learn disabilities are denied. But I think what they do in this story is they remind us of the desire for community. Their acts, if you like, are a reminder of the joyful affirmation that McRobbie talks about. So to conclude, What makes us happy? I've asked this question a lot, and I continue to ask this question. You could say it's a midlife crisis. And I undoubtedly have a different response now. I'm nearly 50 compared with when I was in my 20s. I think if you asked me what made me happy then, it would be politics, parties, clothes and music, in that order. And I'm not immune to those desires today. I like clothes and I still like music. And the new MacBook and the new iMacs do look very pretty. I imagine explorations of far-flung Indonesian islands, perhaps a trip to Kerala. I await the discovery of the perfect espresso. I want social justice. I want to hear no more words of the name Donald or Trump. I want to get rid of Brexit. I want there to be a change to the way in which we're damaging the planet. And some of those desires are more selfish than others. But I think what I do know now, particularly post-pandemic, is that I want to connect with others, to be with others. I have a deep, deep desire to connect and be alongside other human beings. And it seems to me that disability and disability studies already have a lot to say and write and tell us about new ways of desiring, and this desire for connection. And I think for that reason alone, we need to spend a lot more time thinking with disability as we reset what it means to desire. Thank you.
Thank you. That was extremely interesting and, at least to me, hugely provocative. Well, you try to shift the way we looked at desire, the way we conceptualize desire. I did feel that there were a number of questions that went unaddressed or unanswered, but I should not hog this time because we are part of the conference, and I already see a hand up. Samir Chaturvedi already has a hand up, and Samir should ask his question.
Hi, Professor Dan Goodley. Nice to meet you after some time. Hope you're doing well. Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Huh. Nice to hear from you.
Yeah. Professor, I want to ask few things. Let me unpack my question to you. First one is to do with which I mentioned already, like where disabled are seen as best friends, but not as partners. Okay, so on one level, we are close to our non-disabled, or let's say disabled colleagues, because even to assume that every disabled is interested in closeness, establishing a relationship with another disabled is also a bit hypothetical from my understanding. Okay, so first thing, at one level we are close, on the other level we are excluded. First. Second, when you talk about care receiver and caregiving relationships, so yes, it is emotionally fulfilling and everything, but it entails its anxieties. Like my parents are scared to, like if they have some plans for vacation, they often decide against it because they think how Samir would manage himself. I tell them that I will manage myself, but they hesitate going out without me. And then there is another angle to this relationship where there is a power dynamic also. Like if I am pursuing PhD, so they want me to get job as soon as possible because you know that market is not very feasible to PhD scholars. I am talking about academic market right now. and how in India, like disability reservation is not like on paper it is there, but facts are in somewhat complicated ways against it. So even there is a power dynamic of expectation which a disabled individual has to meet. So what do you make out of these nuances of life of disabled? Like at one level, we are close, we are everything, but on the other level, we are judged as an individual. Everyone wants us to do well. And on the third level, we are not seen as intimate partners.
Right.
Okay, 3 points.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. I mean, absolutely. I'm not trying to present an understanding of connection or belonging or community that's not aware of power, and that at the heart of connections, as I think I said earlier, that that these are not without conflict and they're not without tensions, and in cases, connections with one another can be abusive in that sense. I think what it does, though, is that I turn to connection, to belonging, at least front loads the very questions that you're posing now, questions about power, and also questions about, So I think that the first thing to say, I totally accept your point there about the need to infuse any understanding with some critical understanding of power. The second point, I think, which is kind of addressing your first point, is that to desire what we lack can lead us down individualistic and very selfish routes. But it's also, of course, at the heart, also what makes us human. And if you've been denied things like to desire a relationship or desire intimacy or to desire a job, or then, and that's often for a variety of reasons of exclusion, then we need to keep that in mind. So I want to keep together the idea that we desire those things we lack, but also to open up an understanding of desire that can seek out community. I want to have both. I want to have my cake and eat it. At the moment, I feel that the model of desire is only down that first route of desire is lack. Theoretically, I want to be psychoanalytic and Freudian about desire, but I also want to be Deleuzian, Lacanian, or whatever it may be about desire in that sense. So, and I think what that means is that theoretically we can hold contradictory positions, because frankly, that's what humanity is. It's a total contradiction.
That was perfectly answered, because it answers a few questions that were raised in my mind when you were giving your talk. Basically, because the lack that you were talking about earlier, you were suddenly taking it away from the disabled, as if they would not feel the lack, and as if they would. So I think you address that now, which is what I was worried about.
Absolutely.
I saw another hand up, a Santosh, a little while ago, but the hand seems to have disappeared. Does anyone else have questions?
Yes, Professor. Professor Prasad?
Yes.
Sumit.
This is Sandeep here. Sorry, I can't find the hand raised button.
Doesn't matter, Sandeep, please carry on.
Professor Goodley, I just wanted to tell you that towards the end of your lecture, it started raining in New Delhi. So you can imagine the impact of the lecture. I just quickly wanted to ask you, in terms of desire, the point that you brought in about belonging, I think, to my mind, it also comes from the point of comfort that one seeks in one's belonging, right? So I just wanted you to talk to us through that need of comfort that one seeks in desire, and how does that work in the realm of desire, as we've talked about many, looking at psychoanalysis and things like that, but plainly speaking, in realm of comfort, in the idea of connection, or with the idea of connect. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, comfort's a really interesting one, isn't it? Because I mean, we can read that idea of comfort in many different ways. I suppose one of the, pre-pandemic, it felt to me that there didn't seem to be a lot of perceived joy in comfort, or the mundane, or the everyday. And I recognize that I'm kind of collapsing some of those things together, perhaps in a problematic way. But it seems to me that, I could just find myself observing more and more this kind of ceaseless, uncomfortable desire for things that people feel they lack all around me, and also finding myself caught up in that. And that actually there's something that's something problematic about how a model of desire has taken over what it means to be human, and that we wouldn't find joy and comfort, right? I wonder if we'd often see the words comfortable and joy in the same sentence. And interesting, then the pandemic comes along, and people find, firstly, for many people, particularly disabled people, this was, simply a case of survival. But then that, at the same time, they were seeing people around them taking comfort in community.
Yeah.
And that seemed to be really, it was kind of amusing that people suddenly felt this is a really radical idea, that people, that if we all got together and shared our resources, we could be supporting one another. Isn't this amazing? And which is kind of infuriating when disabled people have for years argued for the need for proper community. So I'm wondering whether, in your question there, the notion of comfort, whether we need to kind of reclaim that.
Yes.
Is that where you're kind of going with it in terms of your own thinking?
Yes, to a large extent, because a lot of ground seems to have been lost during the pandemic, and one is trying to sort of work towards, sort of regaining a lot of it. Because I'm a person with visual impairment, and I see this pandemic actually made us a lot way more disabled, because, our life depends on touch, and they said, don't touch.
Yes. Yeah.
So it has been a lot more difficult, but I guess as we are sort of looking ahead, one is devising one's own methods of reclaiming the space that one once had it comfortably.
Yes. Yeah. And I think there's something. I mean, one of the ways we might want to bring together the kind of the experiences of disabled people alongside the experiences of non-disabled people is around that kind of that common feeling experience people have had of loss with the loss of touch. I mean, obviously it can be a lot more profound, obviously, with visual impairment, but I think there's also a kind of general feeling amongst many people of mourning that physical, intimate connection with one another. I mean, I made the huge mistake. I went to a 60th birthday party on Saturday night, and I saw someone, I immediately hugged them.
Yeah.
And,
but I'm very sorry, go on.
No, go on.
No, I was just thinking about your distinction of the two words you made, how one is related and how one belongs. I mean, with the example of your wife, I think it's a very important distinction that I didn't think of, being from English. Actually, it does sort of make a lot of things different from the way one asks, how is one related to how one belongs. So thank you for that, that point.
Thank you, Sandeep.
Thank you, sir.
There is a question here from Shivani. So just carrying on. Thank you, Sandeep. Can desire, being a biopsychosocial phenomenon, become a hindrance to the experiences of disability, which often is subjective, personal? In other words, does the agency of desire dislocate or reconstruct the self and identity of person with disability in a different way? This is a question in the chat box. So,
wow. Well, that is a question.
Yes.
So I'm interpreting the question, and please correct me if I'm wrong here. I'm interpreting the question along the lines of, are we in danger of becoming too individualistic through return to desire? Is that where the question is coming from?
Right, I think so. what is because it's a bios, as she says, psychosocial phenomenon. What happens to the experience of disability, which is personal, which is completely personal? So, does it dislocate or reconstruct the self? It's a very difficult question. I would
It's
say.
a beautiful question. Beautiful. I mean, I think at the heart of any philosophy of desire, there's an opportunity to plug the gaps of our subjectivity that are missing, and at the same time as plugging gaps to challenge that, well, maybe even create other gaps, maybe to challenge the subject. So there's a lovely phrase that comes out of Deleuzean theory, which talks about the idea of almost like kind of opening up this psyche, the subject, and letting it kind of just explode, and to find our psychology, if you like, in our connections with other people. But of course, the big question of that model is, what will that look like in the mirror? You know, what would that look like in the mirror? What would that feel like? And if you couldn't see, what would it feel like? It would feel very disrupted. So it's about having both. It's about keeping a dynamic understanding of desire. If we find that our turn to desire is taking us down some very individualistic or biopsychological routes, then I think we're in trouble. If we are sitting with desire and it's allowing us to think politically and psychologically together, then I think that's good. But I would not want any kind of turn to desire to, you know, kind of take us down a road whereby we'd all have to seek therapy and Freud. You know, I'd want to, desire, I think, is something about something more than the individual. I think it's something about collectivity. I also think collectivity has at its heart a desire that we need to think of. But I do take that point. I think it's a really interesting critique and something to keep in mind. Like the earlier question around, you know, well, what about the politics here and the history of disabled people who've been denied basic desires?
Right.
Professor Prasad.
I know there were a couple of hands up, but there are also 2 questions in the box. So I just read one more question from the box, and then we can get the people who want to talk. This is because it's related, and it's also in a sense of theoretic, in terms of theory. Praveen Patel wants to ask, he wants to know whether the Lacanian concept of desire, that is, desire is an absolute condition, does it create a binary hierarchy which disability studies has always tried to resist or dismantle? Please clarify. And with a thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, so my reading of Lacanian ideas of desire, that we desire what we lack, is in one sense helpful because it understands how desire is channeled and understood, but is totally limited if that's all we end up doing. So Lacan's idea that, at its most kind of magnified, the modern subject is just this kind of endless desiring of the things they lack entity is hugely problematic, particularly when those people occupy positions of privilege. And so, yes, I think that disability studies comes along and really challenges that. And I think at the same time, disability, whilst recognizing that this desiring the things we lack is absolutely crucial when we want human rights, inclusive education, proper support during the pandemic. That's absolutely right. No, one should not get rid of that model of desire. I think disability comes along and says, this is hugely problematic because actually one of the things that is at the root of that model of desire is the eradication of disability. I desire to not be disabled, right? So I think there's something in that. So that said, I think Lacan used properly, that is, to read culture rather than to offer a development model of the child, is worth doing some work with.
Right. There are I set up two questions in the box, but before that, let me get Santosh Kumar in because Santosh's hand has been raised for a while.
Hi. Thank you, Professor Prasad. And thank you, Professor Goodley, for your wonderful presentation. I was just wondering, I mean, we have been thinking about desire from the perspective of disabled body. What about then the desire from the perspective of non-disabled people or body, right? What is the nature of the desire that non-disabled people have, and how that can be understood from the trajectory that you have mapped out? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question, and I suppose, you know, in terms of thinking about desire in the past, I would never want to suggest that a particular model or theory of desire should be, you know, I'm going to try and answer this. I suppose in the past and still, my main interest is around non-disabled people's desire. Because as a non-disabled person, I think I have something to say there, particularly around the ways in which this kind of non-disabled dominant register deploys this model of desire, which is very dangerous. And at the heart of that desire is this kind of eradication of that which is troubling. And part of that, of course, is disabled people. So I want to do some, you know, I want there to be some serious kind of conversations to be had around non-disabled people's models of desire and how disability is implicated in that. At the same time, and I think there's something here about, maybe it goes back to that kind of question about Lacan, and maybe about, if you like, if we call them the theorists of desire as lack. Let's say psychoanalysis is a community of theorists that are interested in desire as lack. I think there's something troubling, but also important to address in the ways in which disability does become desired in particularly dangerous ways by the non-disabled imaginary. So the way in which disabled people become fetishized by non-disabled people. The ways in which disabled people come to occupy an important aspect of non-disabled people's subjectivity and psyche that in many ways can be very dangerous. I'm thinking there, for example, of need freaks, you know, people that feel the need to be around disabled people because it makes them feel good about themselves. Or the ways in which even now it seems in the UK, it's absolutely acceptable to tell a joke about disabled people. I went to a comedy night before the pandemic, 5 comedians, every single one of those comedians made a joke about a blind person. Joke in inverted commas, of course. You know, in order for us to really kind of grapple with what is going on there, I think we need to start asking some kind of psychosocial questions or psychopolitical questions, to borrow from Fanon. What is it that is permitting the human desire of those comedians at that moment to feel it is perfectly acceptable to find joy and humor in the belittling of a disabled person? And I think we can talk in structural ways, yes, structural ways, but I think we also need to get serious about the psychosocial too.
Right. There's
Professor
related
Prasad,
questions. Yes.
Sir, can I raise my question? Professor Prasad,
Yes.
with your kind permission.
Yes.
I'm Rajesh from Chandigarh, Punjab University. And sir, my question is with regard to a story. I just read that story. That story is basically in the Punjabi. And the title of the story is Rod. And that story is about, what to say, a female protagonist who gets disturbed, or rather I should say mentally derailed, seeing some violent images of rape on television. So somehow she becomes deluded, she becomes suffering from OCD, that is obsessive compulsive disorder. And she does what happens is seeing the two rapes that took place in Delhi. One that was about Nirbhaya and the other one is about Nupur. Okay, so when she happens to see the images of these two women who have been were raped and killed. So when in that story, the protagonist, when she happens to see that thing, she also gets mentally derailed, and she becomes deluded also.
So,
And then her life gets upset. So my question to you is this one, sir, how to theoretically connect this issue of like what's the darker side of media effect that damages the psyche of the woman. So I'm like this, can you suggest some book or some theoretical thinkers through which I can connect that the darker side of media, especially that of violence and rape, and that affect the psyche of the people?
Thank you.
The viewers. Thank you so much.
And would you like to address it?
Yeah, I mean, from the disability world, I mean, I think there's been some important work from what we might call cultural disability studies, which is often comes from a humanities perspective, that has sought to explore the ways in which dominant imaginaries and symbolic orders frame how people see themselves. And so I think about people like Brian Watermeyer in South Africa, who's written about this, but also, you know, to bring things more local, the work of Anita Guy in India, which has always been incredibly critically engaged in what I would call a social psychoanalytic frame, in the sense that I think what Anita does is, as a feminist disabled person, a disability scholar, is to consider the impact of the cultural imaginary upon the individual self, upon the psyche. And I mean, I just, you know, today I often do, I often quoting from Anita or using Anita's work in my writing. I just give you an example of that would be, you know, her disembodied work in 2006 paper, where she essentially poses the question, what would it mean to be a disabled person living in a cultural context, in an imaginary, where you are erased, where you are, you know, where the language of you is of lack. So I think it's a very important question you pose. And again, I would point here to the work, particularly disabled feminists, who've offered some incredibly important critiques of the way in which cultural imaginaries that might come through in the text of media are impacting on people's everyday lives.
Then there's a set of questions, two questions from Saksham Arora, and they relate to some of the discussion we were having earlier. So the first question is, to what extent are the disabled influenced by objects of desire that circulate in society? The second question is there validity in the statement that lack, which is located in the disabled body mind by an ableist society and sometimes internalized by the disabled themselves, gives rise to a desire to remove that lack? Your views on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the first question, all of us are influenced by the objects of desire that circulate in society, without a doubt. And to deny that would be a nonsense. You know, we are absolutely caught up in the objects of desire. Some people, obviously, because of material means, have the opportunity to engage with that more than others, but we're all caught up with that. And I think, yeah, this point about the ableist register, and here you would turn to the work of Frantz Fanon, in the sense that if the imaginary, if the register, if the order, the symbolic order around you only frames you in terms of either lacking or deficient, or even erases you, then it's no surprise that people might find themselves utilizing that to erase themselves. And I think this is a really big issue, of course, if we think around disabled children. And for me, the idea of inclusive education in the UK is a lie, it's a nonsense, it's a complete contradiction in terms. I'm not quite sure how a disabled person is meant to include, a disabled child is meant to include themselves in an education system that has been designed and is geared up not for them. It's designed for an idealized pupil that is self-sufficient, entrepreneurial, and will crack on and do the work needed of that school. So there you have just literally entering a gate of a playground, the primary school. You are hit with the imaginary, to use your language, which is you don't belong here. And therefore you will find yourself lacking. And so the amount of work that needs to be done just with disabled young people to remind themselves of the values that they have to themselves and other people and society more broadly is so huge, it seems to me, and a massive tragedy and failing of inclusive education. And so I feel that inclusive education is understandably focused upon culture, structure, history, politics, economics, so on. We need to engage the psycho-political as well.
The next question in the box here from Shankar Reddy takes up for scrutiny your term interdependence, really. The question is, fulfilling of desire in the disabled people is mostly instigated or facilitated, if you want, by non-disabled people. Does it not trap the life of the disabled person? Is it not harmful?
I mean, yes, if that was the case, mostly instigated by non-disabled people. But I think, again, one of the things we need to, I take that point on, right? Absolutely. And non-disabled people themselves have to spend some, do some serious work on themselves in terms, if that's the kind of role they're filling. But it's interesting, the literature around disability community, disability psychology, it rarely kind of enters that literature from thinking about the organizations and communities that are peopled and led by disabled people. And there are lots, there are many that exist. Historically, there have been, and there are many that exist now. Yeah. And it seems to me that we might answer that question or consider that question purely in terms of the dominant cultural imaginary, which is peopled and policed and patrolled by non-disabled people. But what about the organizations that are run by disabled people, for disabled people? What about the communities that are created by disabled people? And I think this is where disability studies has always been strong, because of course it comes from, and has come from, the politics and the organization, the self-organization of disabled people. So I'd want to kind of, if you like, resist some of the assumptions within the question and turn again to the organic intellectuals of the disabled people's movement.
Fair enough. I think that's a decent answer, really. It forces us to think about what we mean by this, right? Why do we assume that you're dependent on, the interdependence actually has the disabled on the one hand and the non-disabled on the other? I think that's the answer here.
Professor Prasad, can I ask a small question?
Who is this, please? I can't see.
Samir.
Yeah, please. Yes. Go ahead.
Professor Goodley, I want to ask a question which Santosh posed, and I want to go in details of it. Like, I have seen and I have somebody in my life, a very close friend, who has an intellectual disabled friend, disabled brother. And probably her family so far never really come in terms with his disability, being a male and a disabled. So the brunt of it comes to my friend who is very close to me, and she says that, Samir, sometimes I feel that it is because my father never really accepted disability of my brother, and he often like his anguish, his anger, and his non-fulfillment of this desire often comes to me in the form of his irritations, and he often uh, scolded me out of no reason. So how we can understand this aspect of caregivers and care receivers relation?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of reading and understanding those kind of reactions and moments within a familial relationship like that, the lesson for me from disability studies, of course, is that we have to provide a social, a cultural, a historical, a political, an economic reading of the reasons behind, the possible reasons behind why people are responding. I think the tendency within our society is to go for a very quick, knee-jerky, individualistic understanding of how family members come to understand, those around them. So I think what I want to do would be, to think about, well, what are the kind of cultural and cultural practices that are, if you like, incubating those kind of ideas. And this, of course, is where, the impacts of disabled people's organisations on education and popular culture are absolutely crucial, of coming up with new ways of understanding disability, more affirmative ways of understanding disability.
Right. I don't see any questions in the box. Does anyone want to ask a question? I think now then we are moving towards the end of this. Oh yes, let's say there is a question coming up. 1 second. This is Saksham Arora again. Can we say some desires lead to different forms of oppression?
Yeah, I think definitely the desire for Botox. I mean, I'm being flippant. Yeah, I mean, I think there are some desires, aren't there, that's, that are worryingly individualistic and narcissistic, and forms of narcissism that might be called, I don't know, gendered or whatever, you racialized in particular ways. Absolutely.
Yes, of course. Right.
Professor, one small query, if you may allow.
Yes.
Done. Just like how a scholar would respond to a narration where a schizophrenic child hits his mother so badly that she has to get medical treatment. So how, as a disability studies scholar, we should react to such realities?
I think by wanting to know about context, about wanting to ensure that any understanding of that is given, that contextualization, and as I'm sure you would go along with this, is not to seek kind of quick, easy, pathological answers, really.
There's a hand raised there. Shamishta Trija.
Menus, meeting tools, audio now.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, hi, Professor Goodley, and thank you so much, Professor Prasad, for letting me in. So basically, I just wanted a conclusion because there has been a lot of things for me to take back. So I just wanted to ask Professor Goodley to just kind of conclude in the sense, am I right that you began with desire, beginning and then moving on to relativity, and how relatedness and belonging is different, and then you moved on to belonging. So I was just trying to connect these three just now, but I think I was unable to, so I seek for your help here. That's all.
I think the conclusion would be that, you know, I live my own life in a kind of split consciousness between desiring the new iPhone and desiring connection. And that actually what we need to do is to think, spend a bit more time, a lot more time, in terms of the latter form of desire around connection and belonging. Because within that, we will actually find, not the sense that we will have our desires sated, but that we'll actually find that we will end up desiring new kinds of ways of being with one another in the world.
This is extremely interesting, and I know we have a time limit, but I want to take two more questions because one hand is raised there and one question is there in the question in the chat. So XB, I don't know who that is.
Yes, sir. It's Shampapul. Thank you, Professor Goodley, for this very thought-provoking session. So my question is, like in some sociocultural, based on sociocultural values or context, sometimes we see that we persons with disability need to curb our desires sometimes, in the sense our likings, etc. So, and sometimes this become a bit oppressive, mentally oppressive to the persons with disability. So what is your opinion regarding this, sir?
I think I struggled to get the question.
Yes, sir. Sometime in some sociocultural context or some sociocultural value, the persons with disability need to curb their desires. I mean, all of a sudden, if from a able-bodied person you become a disabled person, then what previously were your desires or likings, things of likings, you need to curb them. You need to kind of change them based on that sociocultural views, perspective for a disabled person. So, and it becomes, sometimes it becomes a bit oppressive to the mind of a person with disability. So in this regard, what is your opinion, sir?
How do you overcome? Is that the question?
I think that we do it through community, through belonging and connection with one another.
For example, I can give even example for better understanding, perhaps. See, in India, in any kind of, for example, film industry, no one can see. Most often, we have seen able-bodied person, though they are presenting disabled persons in their characterization, whatever. But they are taking a non-disabled person to enact those. But here is no rather not better chance for any disabled person whatsoever. And so this is kind of a barrier, you can say, for the disabled persons with disability to go to that field. So if any person with disability wants to go to that industry, then they are not supposed to go there, not allowed to go there. So in that sense, they need to curb their desire that no, this is not for us, like that. So I mean, is this, do you think, how much it kind of affect a person with disability when they need to curb their desire?
Absolutely, and I think that's that's a really important point around the psychosocial impacts of living in a society which does not actually value who you are, and also puts those kind of barriers in place.
Professor Prasad, just last question. One question, sir.
No, please. That's the last question that I want to read out because it's been there for a while. I know there are more questions, but I'm going to make this the last one. How do we study desire in connection with gender and disability, as desire is determined by gender as well?
Absolutely. They did any conception of desire and disability could never be understood properly without making connections with other issues, and gender would be a key one. Thank you.
Yes, of course. Because Someshwar has put his video on for a while, so I think he's worried about the time. And So I just put, I used the and said that was the last question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Prasad, for sticking to the time and for timing things out so beautifully.
Thank you.
And sharing the session.
But I must thank you, before you start give you the last words, I must thank Dan for a wonderful, provocative, interesting talk. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Glad I was asked to chair this session. I've enjoyed the discussion, the questions. And I must also thank the two interpreters, Stuti and
thank you.
But thank you very much, both of you. Now yours.
Thank you, sir, for almost doing my job of thanking the speaker for such a thought-provoking and stimulating session. The way that you went about problematizing desire through the category of disability and trying to use the category of desire to understand disabled existence has really opened our eyes to a number of nuances that perhaps were laying hidden in our subconscious. Thank you for bringing them to surface and illuminating us on the issue of what desire means and how does disability affect desire and how does desire affect disabled existence. That was really an engrossing session, and I hope that we will have the good fortune of having you at the center in future and learning from you. I would also like to thank the participants for their engaging question. And of course, the sign language interpreters. They add a different dimension to the proceedings and in their silence send out signals that we should take seriously.
Yeah.
It's now time to break. And after the break, we will have Professor Eva Kitty on disability and the ethics of care. So I would request everybody to rejoin 5 minutes before the schedule is starting at 6 p.m. Thank you, Professor Prasad and Professor Goodley, for making this a memorable session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.